Welcome back, my favorite Python programmers, to a brand new video, and in this one we're going to be creating a library management system using object-oriented programming in Python as a Python exercise, and we're going to be covering the following topics. So, if at any point you feel that you're enjoying the contents of this video, as always, please make sure to smash that like button because I need to beat whatever algorithm out there that there is. So, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so as always, we're going to be starting off with the program guide. This is where you have to try and do your best. I'm going to give you the outline of how the program should look like. You have to go and try to do your best, and it's just important that you actually try to test out your skills, see how it works, see how it doesn't, and then see the solution that I give you. This will reinforce your learning process. In any case, let's go ahead and get started. First, you need to create a class book that has a constructor that takes in the title, author, and the ISBN number. If you don't know what ISBN number, I don't know what that stands for, but I do know that every single book has that number. It's just an ID for the book. Because, sometimes you might have books with the same title and the same author. I don't know. Anyways, inside the constructor, we need to set three attributes: the title, author, and ISBN. Of course, this is based on what the constructor has received. And you need to add another boolean attribute that is the isBorrowed and set it initially to false. So if you don't know how a library works, basically you can borrow books from there. And there we go, we set it to isBorrowed false. Next, you need to create 4 book instances. I'm going to leave some information in the description that you can copy. Next, you'll need to override the __str method and print out the attributes properly. Now, this is something that we've seen before in the previous video, I believe, but if you don't know how it works, I do recommend that you Google it or whatever, use ChatGPT. Don't overuse ChatGPT, please, because you need to learn how to do this on your own. Next, create a class library that has a constructor that initializes a list of books to an empty list. The constructor shouldn't take any parameters. So we're creating a new class that is the library, and the constructor just has a list of books. Keep in mind, I gave you a hint in here, no parameters sent to it. Define a method addBook that takes in a book instance as a parameter and appends that book to its list of books. So a method that adds books. Define a method listBooks that lists all the books in the library in a proper manner. Define a method borrowBook that takes in an ISBN number and sets the books isBorrowed, the books meaning the book that has that ISBN number. So there are some loops that you need to do in here. Loop the books isBorrowed attribute to true. Make sure that the book is there and that it has not been borrowed, because a book that has been borrowed cannot be borrowed again. Next, you'll need to define a method returnBook that returns a borrowed book. The book needs to have been borrowed. So again, some if statements in here that you need to come up with, and that is basically it. And of course, you have to test out all of these methods that you create, all of these overrides that you make. And if you want to create your own instances, add more instances than are available, please do that. Pause the video right now and go do the program guide. Okay, so as you can see in here, first we define the class book. And in Python, a class is like a blueprint for creating objects. And when I say objects, of course, I'm referring to individual instances of the class. If you did not understand any of what I said, then I do recommend that you go watch the object-oriented programming video that I did. I'm going to link it somewhere at the top. Now, you can think of this class or this blueprint as a template for books, where each book will have specific attributes like title, author, and ISBN. And that means that, for example, I can create a book with a specific title, and then I create another book with a different title, and all of these will be instances of the class book. So this is like a blueprint or a template from which all other books will be created. So let's dig into this. First, of course, whenever you're defining a class, Finally, you can use the uppercase letter at the start whenever you're defining a method or a variable in Python. It's preferred that you use lowercase as the first letter. In the case of the class, you can use, or you have to use, a uppercase. There's no error, there's no warning, but this is how we prefer to write Python. And in any case, within the book class, we define the special method that is the init. Now, this is known as the initializer, sometimes also called the constructor in Python, and it's called automatically whenever you create a new instance of a class. And the purpose of this method is to initialize the new object's attributes with their initial values. And keep in mind, in here I told you that we need the title, author, and ISBN, but you might have noticed while you were writing the init, when you hit tab to autocomplete, the self gets added on its own. So what is this self? And of course I've explained this many times, but if you're bored with all of this, you should know that I usually assume that somebody that's watching this video has no idea what all of these things are, so I'm going to explain them, but as we go on, I'm going to keep the explanations briefer and briefer. Anyways, here the self refers to the current instance of the class, and it's how we are able to set the attributes specific for the instance only. So along with the self, we have three parameters: the title, author, and ISBN. And if my explanation of the self was not very clear, just know that it refers to a specific instance, and I will go back to it when we create these instances. In any case, inside, of course, with the self, we've provided the title, author, and the ISBN, and these are the information that we need to provide whenever we are creating a book object. So every time you want to create a book, you have to provide it with a title, author, and this ISBN number, otherwise you will get an error. Now, inside of the init method, we then assign these parameters to instance attributes, and the instance attributes are variables that are specific to each object created from the class. This means that every book object will have its own title, its own author, and its own ISBN. Now, on top of these, so keep in mind that this is an attribute. Notice when I double click on it and hover over it, it says instance attribute. But this one, this is the parameter sent. Notice when I double click on it, this one is highlighted as well. So it's just, we could have called this X if we wanted, and there is no problem with that. But it's just a convenient way to name your attributes the same thing that you've named your parameters that are sent to the init constructor. This is just a convenient way of writing Python code. Now, after we set these attributes, we also create another, or we add another Boolean attribute that is the isBorrowed. And when I say Boolean, it means it's either false or true, that will track whether this book is currently borrowed or not. And of course, we initialize it to a false because when a book is first created, it hasn't been borrowed yet. And that is our book class definition. With this class, we can now create book objects. Let's go ahead and create these books. Okay, so in here I did not write these out myself. Of course, I got that information from online. You can see that we have Python Crash Course, the Automate the Boring Stuff with Python. All these books are very highly recommended, especially this one. I love the author Swigart, and I get a lot of my project ideas from him. So I highly recommend that you go and get one of their books on Amazon. But anyways, as you can see right here, these are the instances that we were talking about. So the book is an instance of the book class. So notice when I double click, this is highlighted. So book, what does it take in? It takes in the Python Crash Course, that is the title. It takes in the author, who is Eric Matthews, who is the author, and the ISBN number, just a random number. It's not random, but we'll just say that it's random. And you can see that where does the self come into play? Well, the self right here, believe it or not, is actually book 1, even though we haven't sent it directly, but it is indeed the self right here. And then we have book 2. This is another instance, and another instance. And I'm going to right click and I will run, and this is the output that I get. Nothing, because, well, we haven't printed out anything. But whenever we create an instance, just so you can see this live, I'm going to print out hi there, because now I want to show you how whenever we create an instance, the init is called automatically boom, hi there is called 4 times because we've created 4 instances. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so in here, after setting up the basic structure and attributes of our book class, we introduce another or this new special method. This one is called the __str__, and the purpose of this method is to define how an instance of the book class should be represented as a string. So whenever you print out a book object, Python would automatically call this __str method to determine what the string representation of the book should be. And if you've noticed, I always say override the str. Why? Because whenever we define the str, you'll get this circle with the arrow pointing up. When I hover over it, it says override method and object. What does that mean? What we've seen inheritance before. If you haven't, again, I refer you to the previous videos. But what does it mean to override? Whenever we override, it means that we're inheriting from another class. But if you look right here, book just doesn't inherit from anything. Usually when we inherit, there's some kind of class name inside of parentheses right next to the class definition. Well, you can hold down Control and actually click on the str. Oh, excuse me, you can actually, I believe, just click on the circle without holding any controls. Sorry for that. So you click on it and it takes you to this built-in .py. So these are the built-in functions or methods and classes, all of that built into Python. And if we scroll up, we can see that this __str belongs to the class object. So every single class in Python, regardless of what it is, whenever you create it, automatically inherits from the class object. So now, for example, when we create the init, we are kind of inheriting from the library manager, we are inheriting from the object class, but it doesn't say the override. I'm not 100% sure why. I need to also check that out. Why does it not say override? But yes, the init is also overridden. The __str is definitely overridden whenever you define it. But now let me show you something. I'm going to comment this out. All right, and I'm going to print out book 1. So when I right click and I run, boom, as you can see, this is the output that I get. This is just telling me that it's a book object. But when I uncomment these, so select all of these, Ctrl// if you didn't know how to do that, maybe your IDE is different, so it wouldn't comment and uncomment things out. So now when I right click and I run, boom, you can see that this is the output that I get. And it's based on what we've done right here, where we say title and we reference the attribute title. Notice that we're using the self. And how did we know so? Right here, book 1. Whenever I say print book 1, it means that I call the __str. The self is the book 1, and we've already established that the book 1 has its attribute. For example, title is Python Crash Course, so we print out Python Crash Course. Now, one final interesting thing in here is this line right here. So it says that yes if self.borrowed, else no. And what does this mean? Now, this is something that we've covered before, but just glancing. So let me dog this right here below and explain this a little bit better. So you can see, for example, book 1, the representation borrowed is no. Basically, this is a if statement that we wrote on a single line of code. And this is just for us to save some time instead of writing an if statement from scratch and saying if the self.isBorrowed equals true, then write yes, else no. So this is just a good way to write a simple if statement on a single line. So I'm going to dock it back right here at the top, and we are going to be continuing on. Alright, so now we turn our attention to a new class that we're creating, that is the library. So this class will represent a collection of books, and it's where we will manage multiple book instances. So First, we define the class library, and we start with a constructor just like we've done before. And inside of this constructor library, the only thing that we need is the self. Remember, I told you we don't need any other parameters. And I said inside, I mean as a parameter. We only have the self, and now inside of the constructor, we have a single attribute that is an empty list of books. And the idea is that this list will hold all the instances of the class book that are part of this library collection. So now that we have our books right here, we will be able to add them to our library, and they will be inside of this list. So this is going to be a list of, well, books. Before we go, I just wanted to show you that we can also print out, for example, book 3. So when I right click and I run, you can see that the titles are different, the authors are different, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in here we create our first normal method, that is the add book, and it's designed to take in a book object as its parameter and the self, of course, that represents the library instance. We are going to have one library instance, but it's okay. It's good to have the self, and of course the self will always be important. So the book parameter is expected to be an instance of the book class representing the book that we want to add to the library collection. Now within this add book, we perform a very straightforward operation of appending our books list with this book object. And remember that the books list is an attribute of the library class that we've initialized in the construction or the constructor right here, and it's intended to store all the books and book instances that belong to that library. So effectively what we're doing by appending this book list is adding more books to our library collection. And after adding the book, we just have a small confirmation message. I like to have that just so we know that everything works. Now let's go ahead and test it out. Okay, so what did we do in here? First of all, we created an instance of the class library, and notice that it does not take any parameters in here because the constructor does not take any parameters. Next, we're adding several books to this library using the add book. So we add the book 1, we add book 2, we add book 3, and we add book 4. And lastly, what we're doing in here is we're adding instances that we've already created. But what we also can do in here is we are directly creating and adding a new book to the library in a single step. And this is done by, well, the following. So we call the add book just like we've done before, but we immediately send it an instance of the book that we've created on this pod. So instead of adding a pre-existing book object, a new book object was created and added within or using the add book. And I just created, I came out of this like Learn Java by Jane Doe. I don't think that's a real book. Maybe there is a real book that is Learn Java, but I don't think Jane Doe is the author. Anyways, when I right click and I run, boom, as you can see, book Python crash course was added to the library, automate the boring stuff, yada, yada, yada. Everything works good. Okay, so in here we create a new method that is the list books that will allow us to list all of the books that we have in our library. So again, first of all, it doesn't take any parameters except for the self that will be the what instance of our library. Inside we check if not self.books, and basically this allows us to see if the list is empty. If it is indeed empty, that means that there are no books in this library, which means we want to print out that there are no books in this library. And then we have this for loop right here, and basically if we do have some books in our library, we are going to print them out. So we go through every single book. Remember that this is the self.books. This is a list which allows us to go through every single item using the for loop. If you don't know how for loops work, I'm going to link it somewhere at the top. And we set every single individual instance of the book into the book variable, and we print out that book. And remember, when we do this, this method right here is called. So let's go ahead and test this one out. At the bottom right here, I'm going to print, and I'm going to say that library dot list books. Right click and run, and boom, as you can see, this is the output of all of our books. Now, before we go, I just want to test one more thing out. I'm going to hit Ctrl D, hold down Shift Alt, and use the arrow to try and list the books before we add any books to this library. So it should appear right here. When I right click and I run, boom, there we go, no books in this library. So it's very important that you always test out the if statements that you've created. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so this method is the borrowed book, or the borrow book. Takes in two parameters, of course the self and the ISBN. Now the method begins by iterating over each book in the books list, which contains all the book instances currently held in the library. Inside, for each book, we check if the book's ISBN matches the ISBN number that was sent to it as a parameter, and that means we're checking if the book actually exists in our library, and then we check if the book has not been already borrowed. So remember, when we use the not, it means that we flip this one over, and we're using an and in here, which means that this condition right here and this condition right here both need to be true in order for us to get into the block of code. Now, speaking of the block of code, inside, the first thing that we do is we set the isBorrowed attribute to true, and then we print out that we've borrowed a book, and we print out which book was borrowed, and we have this return right here, which just jumps out of the borrow book. Why do we do that? Because if we go through every single book and none of them fit this condition right here, then we will print out book is not available or has been borrowed. And what the return allows us to do is once we find the book and we borrow it and we print out that we've borrowed it, we return, which means we jump out of the method and this no longer prints out. Anyways, I'm going to show you how that works, but first I'm going to scroll down right here to the bottom, and I'm going to test this one out. Alright, so I've already set these from beforehand because I don't want to write these numbers from scratch and I'm going to make some mistakes. So basically in here, I'm actually going to maybe move this up like this so that we can compare them effectively right here. Oh, so the library has not been created, so we can't. We have to write them after we've created the library. All right, there we go. So basically in here, what we're doing is we're trying to borrow a few books. So if you see 01359, you can see that it is this one right here. It ends with 52. That is the programmatic programmer. Then we try to borrow another book that is 15 and ends with 9922, which is this one, which is the automate the boring stuff. Then we try this one, which is the Python crash course, and then we try this one, which is a book that we've already borrowed, and I want to see what happens if we try to borrow a book that we've already borrowed. And one more thing, I want to borrow a book that the ISBN doesn't, or that does not have an ISBN that matches the books that we have. And let's see what would happen in this case. So right click and run, and you can see that the book is not available or has been borrowed. Why? Because again, I made the mistake of not adding the book. And you know what? Now that we figured out which ISBN belongs to which one, I'm simply going to print it out at the bottom. And now when I right click and I run, boom, there we go. You've borrowed the pragmatic programmer, you've borrowed the automate boring stuff, you've borrowed the Python crash course. And when I try to borrow the same book again, you can see the book is not available or has been borrowed. And when I try to borrow a book that is not actually in the library because none of its ISBN exists, then we go, also we have this bad output. Okay, so as you can see, we've created another method that is the return book, and you'll notice that I did not write this code, I simply copied and pasted and made some changes. Why? Because the same steps that we need to take to borrow a book are exactly, I already said it, but they are exactly the same as the steps we need to take to return a book, except for some small minute changes. First, we go through, again, the list of books that we have in the library. Then we check if the ISBN is still there or if we have that book inside, which is exactly the same step that we took right here. And now this is where we start having a difference. In here, when we want to return a book, we don't want to check if the book was not borrowed in order for us to borrow it. We need to check that it has indeed been borrowed so that we can return it. So when now we check and book is borrowed, so we need this one to be true in order for us, or we need this one to be true and this one to be true in order for us to go into the if block where we set the is borrowed to false. Why? Because we are returning a book. And then we also print out that we have returned the book title and we jump out, because if we don't jump out, otherwise we print out that the book is not available or has not been borrowed. Why? Because one of these conditions was not met on any of the books that we checked. So let's go ahead and try to return some books. Okay, so as you can see, first of all, I try to return this book, and then I try to return this book, and then I try to return this same book right here, and then I try to return a book that has a weird ISBN number, so I'll just add 12. So when I right click and I run, if I scroll down, you can see that we have returned the pragmatic programmer, and apparently this is not something that we have anywhere, so I'm simply going to copy this because we know that we've borrowed it. I'm going to paste it and let's see, can we return the automate the boring stuff? Yes, there we go. We can return the automate boring stuff. And one more thing, I want to print out book 1 because we have borrowed the pragmatic programmer, right? That's the, or no, the pragmatic programmer is book 4. So I'm going to try to print out book 4 and I want to see the extra parameter or the attribute that is the is borrowed and how it changes. So boom, there we go. You can see that borrowed is yes, and in here borrowed is no because we have returned it. Right here we borrowed it, and right here we returned it. And our library management system is working great. Okay, fellow Python programmers, congratulations on making it this far. We've covered a lot of stuff. So we've created now 2 classes, the book, that was the first class, and then we created the library class as well, and we have created some methods inside of the library that allows us to manage our books that we have, which is great. And we've covered a lot of stuff. We've learned how to work with classes, with instances, with attributes, with parameters, sent to methods in those classes that modify the attributes in different ways, and we've seen how our system is starting to take shape. Now the next step is to add users and add a layer of complication into our borrowing process. So now we don't just borrow a book, we have a user that is registered to every single book that was borrowed to make sure that that user actually returns the book that he has borrowed. So without any further ado, let's jump into the challenge. Okay, so your challenge is going to be to adding users. First, you'll need to create a new class users with a constructor that takes in the user ID, name, and an email, and create an attribute or create attributes out of these, and also add the __ str special method to print out that user in a nice way. Inside of the library class, add a new attribute of type dictionary to store the users, and the keys will be the user's ID and the values will be the user's object. Now keep in mind, you'll just need to initialize an empty dictionary inside of that library. Define a new method, add user, that takes in a user object as a parameter and adds that user to the user's dictionary. And again, this is a question. Now, I deliberately left it out. Where should you create the add users? Should it be in the book? Should it be in the users? Or should it be in the library? Try to figure that one out. Define a new method that lists all the users, all the users with their info. Define a update user method that allows us to update a user's name or email. It takes in a mandatory user ID parameter and two optional parameters, name and email. Define a delete user method that deletes a user from the library. And we want to assign to every borrowed book a user from our library. So give the book a new attribute borrowed by and make the necessary changes to the __str and also the necessary changes to when a book is borrowed and returned, and the user must now be specified. So this is your challenge. The hardest part is going to be the last one. The medium hard part is going to be figuring out where you should be creating these methods. Pause the video right now and go do the challenge. Alright, so in here we introduce a new class that is the user. This class is designed to represent a user on or in the library, and each user is going to have their unique ID, a name, and an email. And when we define a user class, we have a constructor just like we've had with the library and just like we've had with, well, any class that we've seen so far. It takes in three parameters: user ID, name, and email, and we set the attributes that have the same name as the parameters. As always, this is an attribute. You can see it reflected right here. This is the parameter sent to it. You can see it reflected right here. Following the constructor, we introduce a special method that is the __str, and within this method we simply create a formatted string that will include the user's ID, name, and email represented in a simple yet effective way. Alright, so the next step was to add a new attribute to our library that is the dictionary of users. And in here, this is going to be a dictionary to store all the user objects with user IDs being the keys, because every single user will be able to buy or borrow a book and then return it. Okay, so in here we create or add a new method or define a new method that is the add user, and we do it inside of the library. Why didn't we do it inside of the users? Well, because this is where we are going to be managing our users inside of the library. Now, when you're building a more complicated system and there are much more intricate ways of creating a user and books and etc., you would create a separate class that would manage books, that would manage users, but that is for more advanced topics. For now, because we are going to be borrowing, or at least because we have the dictionary users stored inside of the constructor in a library class, that means that whenever we want to add a user, we have to do it inside of the library class itself. So what do we do in here? First things first is we need to check if the user that we're trying to add already exists in our dictionary, and we do it right here. So the add user has a parameter sent to it that is the user object, and that means that every user will have a user ID, and we're going to be using this user ID to go through the dictionary of users. And remember, when we do this, if user.userid in self.dictionary or in any dictionary that we do, that means that we check all of the keys in that dictionary. So we go through all the keys in that dictionary, and if one of them matches, that means that the user has already been added, which means that the user already exists, and we return, which just means we jump out. Now, if we don't find the user already in the library, we add a new entry into that dictionary using that user ID as a key, and we set the value as the user. And if you don't know how dictionaries work, again, I'm going to link the video of the dictionaries somewhere at the top, and you can follow it. I'm not going to delve too deep. We've already covered this so many times. Let's go ahead and test this one out. Okay, so in here we add two new users, John Doe and Jane Smith, with their email and their number. And as you can see, I did not add a pre-existing user. I created the user on the spot and added them directly to the library. So now when I right click and I run, we should see at the bottom that user John Doe added with an ID and user Jane Smith was also added. Oops, I was a bit quick there. User added with an ID of 2. Okay, so we've created a new method that is the list users. So the first thing that we do inside of here is check if we actually have any users, and that's very important because we are applying this .items method to it, which will cause an error or a warning or a bad message if there are no users. So first we check, are there any users? If not users, that means that the users dictionary is empty, which means that no users are registered, and we return. So we jump out of the list. Now, if it's not empty, if the users dictionary has indeed users, the method will proceed, and each item in dictionary has a key value pair, remember, and with the key being the user ID and the value being the corresponding user instance. And during each iteration, the method retrieves both the user ID and the user, and we do this using the .items. Again, something that we've explained many times when it comes to dictionaries. Basically, the .item returns a tuple that is the user ID and the user, and we unpack them, or actually it returns a tuple that is the key and the value, and in our case it's the user ID and the user. We unpack them into these two variables, or shall we say the temporary variables, and then we print out each individual user. And when we do this, what is being called? Where is it? Right here, the __str is being called because, well, we've overridden that method. So if I scroll down to the bottom right here and I print and I say library.list users, right click, run, and boom, this is the output that I get. Okay, so in here we've defined a new method that is the update user. It takes in 3 parameters. First, it takes in the ID, which is a mandatory parameter to identify which user records needs to be updated. Then it accepts 2 other optional parameters, the name and the email. So for example, the person or the user can provide a user ID without providing the name because they don't want to for example, update the name. They only want to update the email. So they would provide only the name or whatever. They don't provide the email, so the email by default is set to none. This is called a default value for a parameter, and something that we've covered in the functions video. If you want that, I'm going to link it somewhere at the top so you can go and watch it. Now, first of all, we check if the user already exists in the users dictionary. If they are, or they don't, or we don't find it, then we will say that the user is not found and we will return, so we don't go through any of these. Next, we check if the name has been given to us, if the name is something, if name. This basically says if name different than none, which means that a name was provided. So what we do is we update the name. Then we check if email, which means that if the email is not equal to none, then we will update the email. And the way that we do this is, keep in mind, we've already made sure that the user ID already exists. So whenever we say self.user ID, we find the user with that user ID dot name. So we access the name, because remember, this returns the instance or the object user. Then we say dot name, we access the attribute, and we say that it's equal to the name. And the same thing happens right here, where we access the email and we update the email. And notice this email right here, it's different than this email, because this one is the one that was sent to us, and this one is an attribute. If I scroll up, there we go, you can see this is highlighted. So highlighting, very important. That's why I recommend that you get PyCharm. And finally, we print out that the user was indeed updated. So let's go ahead and test it out. Okay, so as you can see right here, I also want to print out users. So as you can see right here, I update the 001, which is John Doe. So I changed the name to Jonathan Doe, and I changed the email to update at example. And then I updated ID2 without updating the name, and I simply said that email is only new email. Okay, only new email. Very good. So, and then I listed all the users. So now when I right click and I run, we should see that Jane Smith has the same name but has a new email that is the only new email. And then John Doe is no longer John Doe, they are Jonathan Doe, of course, with a new email. So this is the update users, works perfectly fine. And if you want, you can also test out, for example, 3, which does not exist. And there we go, user not found. Excellent. Okay, so as you can see right here, we define the delete user. Very simple. I'm not going to delve too deep into it, but basically what we do is we check if the user is in the users using their ID, then we delete that user using the del statement right here that allows us to delete an object from a list or a dictionary or a tuple using this del right here. And finally, we print out that the user was deleted, and the else right here is for this if statement, because if we don't find the user, we print out that we, well, did not find the user. If I scroll down, I'm going to, whoa, we've done a lot. I'm going to test this one out. So this should be pretty simple. Library.delete user and then 001, and I will print out, oops, just duplicate this and print this one out. And I'll just add some spaces in here just to separate things, make them clear, run, and boom. As you can see, we only have Jane Smith. Let's try to delete 3. Boom, user not found. We still have both. Okay, so in here, as the challenge told us, first of all, we created a new parameter or a new attribute, inside of the book that is the borrowed by, and we set it to none because, of course, at first, the book is not borrowed by anyone. Now in the str, you could have simply printed out or added this borrowed by, but I wanted to do something more fancy. So in here, what I did is I created a new variable that is the borrowed by status. And you can see right here, it's going to be yes if the self.borrowed, else no, just like we've had before. But this time you also have yes, comma, by self.borrowed, which will be added right here. If the self.is borrowed, else no. All right, so very simple, nothing too much in here. Now we need to update the methods. Okay, so as you can see, we have updated our borrow book method. I wanted to keep the old one just so you can make some comparisons and so that I also can show you some of the differences. Now, upon calling the borrow book, you can see that the ISBN number is sent, something that we've done the same before, but now this time also the user ID is sent. Now, if the user is not in the self.users, we print out that the user does not exist and we return, so we don't have anything else printed out. Actually, this one should be right here, so this one is not good. I apologize. This was a mistake. I've been recording. Hello there. I've been recording for 1 hour and 7 minutes and I'm very tired. So expect mistakes at this point. Anyways, let's power through this. Where are we? Yes. So if the user ID is not in the users, we print out that they do not exist and we return. And otherwise, if we do not return, we go through every single book that we have, just like we've done before. We check if the ISBN is already there, just like we've done before. And if the book has not been borrowed, just like we've done before, inside we set the is borrowed to true, just like we've done before. And finally, something that we haven't done before is we also set the book.borrow to the user ID. Now you might be tempted to set it to the name, but a user ID is more appropriate in such a situation because you might have two people with the same name and that would not work. So you would need the user ID that should be unique, even though we don't reinforce it, or do we? Yes, we do reinforce it because keep in mind, we cannot add a new user with the same ID. That's very important. We do reinforce it. So the user ID is unique to each individual user, which means that we will not have any mistakes in our system. And then we print out that the user with this user ID has borrowed. Now, something that is slightly better, what you can do in here is you can say that the users with this user ID, and we should say self. So self, if I hit tab, it will disappear. So self dot users with the user ID dot name, so that we have the name. So the user, etc., has borrowed. You can even remove the user to make it more friendly. And finally, we return once the book has been borrowed, or we simply print out the book is not available if we go through every single book and none of these are matching. Or we can also say in here, or has been borrowed. Boom. Boom. This is what I was looking for. I will test this out once I create the return book as well. Okay, congratulations, making it to the final method in here. So return the book. So we go through all the books. It's basically exactly the same, but we add an extra condition in here where before we checked if the book exists, if the ISBN match, then we checked if it has been borrowed, but we also need to check that the book has been borrowed by that user so that we know that that user can actually return the book. So we say that the book has been borrowed, set to false, the book .borrowed by is set to none, and finally we print out that that user has returned that book, and we return, which means we jump out of the method. And in here the book is not available because we have three conditions. So either the book is not available, or it has not been borrowed, or it has not been borrowed by this user. So we have three conditions in here. All three must be true for us to get into the if. If only one of them is false, then this print statement right here is printed out. Okay, so I did not want to write the ISBN numbers. First of all, I don't even remember what these are. I'm not going to go back to the top, but I know that I've checked almost all conditions. So first of all, we borrowed this book. We've already seen this, that ends with 52 by user 1, but I deleted user 3. That's good. So we still have user 3. So user 1 borrows this book, then user 1 borrows this book, then user 2 borrows this one, then user 2 borrows this one, and then user 1 tries to return this one, which they did borrow, and user 2 tries to return this one, which they did borrow as well. And then we are going to right click and run, and we get an error because we have one thing that is required when we click right here. Oh, so this is the old borrow book and this is the old return books. So you have to Ctrl// and uncomment them, because remember, we've uncommented, or we've commented the old return and the old borrow book. That's great. Error, excellent. We learn from our mistakes. Right click and run, and boom, there we go. Right here you can see that the user Jonathan has returned the pragmatic programmer, and he has borrowed the pragmatic programmer. Jonathan has borrowed the automated. Jane has borrowed the Python crash course, and the book is not available or has been borrowed because Jane was trying to borrow a book that was already borrowed right here by Jonathan. So the book was not available. Then Jonathan tried to return this one, and Jane tried to return this book that she did not borrow, because that was Jonathan who borrowed this book right here. Boom, boom. As you can see, everything works perfectly fine. Ladies and gentlemen, congratulations on finishing. And congratulations to me on finishing finally. 1 hour, 15 minutes, battery running out, voice cracking, very tired. Next video, what are we going to do? Wait, let me check. restaurant menu manager. Congratulations, you went from a Python programmer to a restaurant menu managers. To watch this video, click right here, like, subscribe, leave me a comment if you have any questions, and let's go continue your Python programming journey. Let's go. Become the best restaurant menu manager in the world. Let's go.